Welcome to Sorry Not Sorry, where we unapologetically talk about Christianity and culture from a Pentecostal perspective. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jerry Ireland, and I'm here with my buddy Dom Garcia, and this is our inaugural episode of Sorry Not Sorry.
I love it. I'm excited.
I am too. I mean, I've kind of been looking forward to this for a long time.
I'm a little nervous, to be honest with you.
Yeah, me too. It's, this could go one of two ways. It could be great, or it could be a total disaster.
Or heretical. I think that's more where I think it's going, but we're going to stay balanced.
Knowing the two of us,
yes.
It's totally up in the air.
It's going to get interesting quick. There's no doubt about it.
What is unique about this podcast? What is it that we're doing that we feel like fills a gap in the very, very full world of podcasting? And I think that's, we want to talk about Christianity, and we want to talk about culture and the intersection of those two things, but we want to do it from a uniquely Pentecostal perspective.
That's right.
Because nobody's doing it. And if they are, I haven't heard of them.
Yeah, I haven't heard of them either.
Yeah, and I think there's something that Pentecostalism offers and has to contribute to this conversation about what it means to be the church in the 21st century.
Absolutely. For me, one of the things that was so exciting was the opportunity to sit down and to explore these things from, I think, a rather critical and hopefully spirit-led perspective. A lot of times, as we've said before, you have wonderful theologians coming from maybe a Reformed, maybe even a cessationist point of view, but you don't always have people sitting down and asking the question, what does it mean to be Pentecostal outside of a few of the theological things that most people ascribe to us?
Yeah.
There's some other, I think, more important distinctives that have to be discussed, and hopefully in this space we're going to explore those.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the struggles that Pentecostalism has always dealt with, is that, I mean, we don't have a market on crazies, but we have our fair share.
We might have cornered the market, to be honest.
We might have a corner of the market. That's true. And so there's this struggle within Pentecostalism to sort of separate out what we would call authentic Pentecostalism from a classical tradition.
Exactly. From
things like the prosperity gospel, which often not only in academic writings, but absolutely in popular understandings of what Pentecostal is, those things often get conflated.
That's it.
And hopefully, in the course of our discussions, we can clarify that a little bit and have some fun along the way.
Absolutely. I mean, I know that one day at lunch you and I were discussing, oneness Pentecostals, Jesus only, and how many people ascribe the entire Pentecostal movement with that. You and I are both Trinitarian, and we're surprised that people even assume that Pentecostals are non-Trinitarians.
That's right. In fact, when we first came up with this idea, I put a post on Facebook, and a good friend, and I asked people if they would listen to this kind of a podcast, and second, what kind of topics they would like to hear. And one of the first responses I got back was, talk about the prevalence of oneness thought within Pentecostalism. And that just surprised me that was somebody's very first gut reaction was, and I think it was rooted in this assumption that oneness or non-Trinitarian ideas are pervasive. And I think that's not historically been true of Pentecostalism, and I don't think it's true of global Pentecostalism in the 21st century.
Absolutely.
Even though there are pockets of that.
There are, and hopefully, again, as we continue the conversation, what I'm excited about is bringing on scholars, bringing on practitioners who are in the field, who are part of the tradition, who I think could speak to it as well. And that, I think, is going to be really exciting.
Yeah, and we also want to hear from outside voices.
Exactly.
We want to hear from people who don't agree with Pentecostal theology, and there's a lot of people that
okay.
What was that?
And convert them.
That's right. We're going to bring the snakes out, and we're lock the doors.
We haven't talked about that yet. It's so true. I've gotten that too. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah.
It's a trip. It's sometimes these things. It's so strange because when you're I mean, we're going to talk about it in a second, but having been raised in it and seeing the life in which it gives and seeing the willingness to allow the Spirit to move within a corporate expression and the beauty of that. And then you talk to somebody and the assumptions they have, it's like, that's not Pentecostal. And where are you getting that? And it's always the extreme. So hopefully we can combat some of that.
Right. And it's TBN. I mean, that's...
Well, a lot of it is, the prosperity and the TBN.
That's the
celebrity
face of Pentecostalism for a lot of
and
people.
This stuff is crazy.
Yeah, the big hair and the,
Well, I'm working on it. You know what I mean? I'm growing it out a little bit. You know what I mean? Thank you. I appreciate it.
So
less gold, though.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm going to try.
But maybe next week.
Maybe if this really takes off, maybe we can get some gold. Maybe we can get some gold chairs. You know what I mean? Down the road, we'll see.
Yeah. By the way, that's Tim Jackson, our producer.
Who's our producer? So we will definitely doing some asides to Tim as well. He's shaking his head and enjoying it. All right, good.
So we're all about the prosperity.
Oh man, we're gonna go right after it. We're gonna go after that thing full steam. Anyway.
The truth is, we hate the prosperity gospel.
Can't stand it. We're very nervous.
It's
an affront to the gospel.
It is the anti-gospel.
Absolutely.
It's everything contrary to what Jesus taught and preached.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more.
It's all about me. It's all about what's going to make my life happier and more fulfilling. When Jesus taught that's another podcast.
That's another podcast.
Let me not go down that road right now.
Yeah.
But one of the things we want to talk about in this initial podcast is an idea that I think not a lot of people have ever heard, but one that is historically true, and I think it's theologically true of classical Pentecostalism, and that is the idea that Pentecostalism is synonymous with missions.
Absolutely.
What do you think about that?
I mean, for me, a lot of times growing up, you would often hear, we would discuss Acts 2, which is essential. There's no question.
So you grew up in Pentecostalism.
I grew up in Pentecostalism. Absolutely. It goes way back. Great-great-grandmother so-and-so got the baptism, and supposedly a circuit rider had to come in and explain what was going on because they thought she'd gone senile. But then later on, my great-grandfather was a Pentecostal holiness minister. My mom was raised PH. My parents landed at an AG church in 79, had been there for over 40 years, or 40 years at this point. Yeah. So I was very much raised in it.
So I wasn't. I grew up in the Episcopal Church.
Okay.
But we had a spirit-filled Episcopal priest who spoke in tongues. And
really? So charismatic renewal.
Absolutely. Yeah. So one day we'll talk about that, the whole differences between Pentecostalism, charismatic renewal, third wave, neo-Pentecostalism. Those are kind of the big broad categories of that most people use for taxonomies of modern day Pentecostalism. And we'll get into all that. But I think this idea of the association between Pentecostalism and missions is absolutely fundamental to what Pentecostalism is and has historically been. Absolutely.
I mean, again, Acts 2, Acts 10, Acts 19, essential, but Acts 1:8 changed my life. I mean, when I really looked at that and I understood that it's to the nations. I mean, this proclamation, the power to share to the ends of the earth, that didn't end in Judea and Samaria. That's to us. We're Acts 29, right? This is a very popular term, but I think it's true.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to understand that what is being defined there is truly Pentecostal theology.
Yeah, and it's, if you look historically back at, say, Azusa Street, which at one point the common consensus was that Azusa Street was the beginning of Pentecostalism. Now scholars have pulled back from that, and it's much more common to hear things like Azusa Street was one of many global revivals that were taking place about the same time around the globe that in which people experienced speaking in tongues and other manifestations of the Spirit, and from that had developed what James Dunn calls an eschatological urgency. This sense that this move of the Spirit was indicative of Jesus coming back very soon, and so what did that mean for the church? It meant that if Jesus was going to return, then there's one thing we absolutely have to do, and that's tell everybody about Jesus.
Absolutely.
And that was the ethos of early Pentecostalism. And you saw from places like Azusa Street, you saw within a couple of years, missionaries fan out around the globe to take the gospel to very, very difficult places. many of them went on what one Pentecostal scholar refers to as they were missionaries of the one-way ticket. They packed their belongings in coffins because they had no expectation of coming back. And many of them died in places like Africa and Latin America and so on, from malaria and whatever. But that's has been a defining characteristic of who Pentecostals are. And I think in some ways we're in danger of losing that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think for me, one of the things that was exciting about this was Pentecostalism to me is a renewal movement. It was the way in which people were awakened to the reality of Christ's imminent return, which of course we see in Scripture, and I think many traditions embrace, but I don't think they put it into practice. And I think that's the beauty of the Missio Dei. I think that's the beauty of Pentecostalism being, or even the Assemblies of God specifically being a missions organization, that this isn't just about us getting into a space and exalting the Lord, which is wonderful corporate expression, ecclesial structures, but here's I'm going to be transparent. I'm just going to go after it. Here's the deal. I think when you're looking at Pentecostalism within the first few years, you're seeing an urgency. As time went on, we solidified forms and practices. We aligned ourselves with the evangelical movement, and we just became another fellowship. Honestly, we became a denomination. And I think what's exciting is that there are...
Even though we don't call ourselves
Of course we don't, but we are, clearly.
But we are.
And I think what we want is to go back and say, no, we need that urgency again. It's okay to solidify forms of practice. It's okay to have these traditions, fellowships, whatever we want to call, but we need to get back to the emphasis of who we are, which is to proclaim the gospel. And the way we do it is through the power of the Spirit.
That's right. It wasn't theological. The early Pentecostals had a theology,
yes,
but it was an experiential theology that they found validity for in the pages of the New Testament.
So?
And sensed in what was happening an urgency to reach the lost. And I think a lot of things have moved us away from that. One of the things I think is that Pentecostal excesses in a lot of churches, there was the whole banner waving season of whatever that was about.
You got to get your tambourine. Come on,
you get your tambourines and your banners, and everybody just had a big, I don't know what it was.
It was mass hysteria, but we're going to be nice on this podcast.
Yes, that's right. But it had very little to do with, I think, the kind of move of the Spirit that you see in Scripture in the pages of the New Testament, in which Scripture moves people from where they are to go out.
Absolutely. Acts 2, they're in the upper room. There is a move of the Spirit. And then they go out. If there's a move of the Spirit and you stay in the room, what are we? I feel like oftentimes our wonderful Pentecostal churches, even some of our, there's and I don't want to get specific with names, but there's a place in which people pray and worship for 24 hours. And there's something special about this. But there's a purpose to that. It's not just sitting in the upper room. It's to then go out and proclaim as Peter did.
That's right. Yeah.
And this is, I think, what we're trying to push people towards.
Yeah. And so there is this, in a sense, there's a reaction to these excesses in which a lot of churches said, okay, this has gotten way out of control. This is insanity. Let's dial it back. And I think sometimes maybe we, as we tend to do in the church, historically, on every issue, swing the pendulum from one extreme to the other. And now we're back to, in many Assemblies of God churches, for example, and I've been in a lot of them, it's hard to tell the difference between that church and the Baptist church down the street, except maybe people are raising their hands.
Right. It's not, we're non-denominational. We're non-denominational in, I would say, ecclesial practices. Theologically, if you got down to it, okay, see subsequent experience, baptism of the Holy Spirit, you see initial physical evidence. But we're not seeing manifestations in services. And I also would say some churches aren't emphasizing mission as they should. Not all. There's some wonderful churches. Again, we're not prescribing this to all, but again, I think that hopefully people feel called to missions, but also this is we're calling out the church a little bit, but not too much. Maybe we edit that out.
Well, the church needs to be called out. Let's be honest.
I know. Well, at least calling out the Pentecostal tradition, right? Because that's our family.
Let's start
right?
with us.
Exactly, because I think that's
ourselves.
Important. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I agree. There's a really great book by a guy named Michael Goheen called A Light to the Nations, where he develops this what he calls a missional ecclesiology, and sort of the central idea is, which you see in the title, A Light to the Nations, is that in the Old Testament, Israel's identity was defined by their relationship to the nations. That you cannot understand Israel's purpose and function unless you understand it in light of the nations. And so as with Israel, so too with the church.
Right.
Therefore, you cannot understand the purpose of the church unless you understand the church in relation to the nations.
That's
and he
correct.
kind of builds this on a lot of Leslie Newbegin, who we all love and adore, who great missiologist, and who made a distinction between mission, sort of what the church does in its local environment, and missions, plural, which is the cross-cultural mandate of the church. And I think we've lost sight of this missional ecclesiology that Goheen talks about, because we've tended to define the church by what it does, by this sort of a functional ecclesiology. In other words, a church is defined by mission, or by proclamation, service, prayer, all of these various things that it does in its context. But the problem is that it can do all of those things, which are all biblical things, and still not be concerned about the nations.
Right.
So we have to come back to that, I think. We have to rediscover this idea that who we are as the people of God is especially defined by our role among the nations.
And that's why I think this is such an important message specific to the Pentecostal tradition and within us, really the Assemblies of God, because so often we are very experiential in our worship. We go on a Sunday or a Wednesday night or whenever. It used to be, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, all these things. And we would go and we would experience God in a really supernatural way. And hopefully that's to build you up, to send you out.
Yeah.
But the problem is the missions, as you're saying, I don't think is happening as it should. So we're seeking the Spirit. We're seeking the presence of God. We're seeking this experiential moment. And yet then once we get it, it's selfish. It's just about our experience.
And I think a lot of it is because we've settled down.
Exactly.
Exactly what you were saying earlier, this idea that we have become institutionalized. And once that takes place, you lose this sense of us being a pilgrim people. Like we read about in 1 Peter 2:11, which I love this verse. It says, "Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against the soul." And I think that's a verse that challenges the ethos of the American church, because we've become wrapped up in the consumerism and in the individualism of our culture, and in many ways we've lost sight of this trajectory that Goheen is talking about.
But I think for me, the other thing that's so problematic, and I don't even know if we want to go there, is nationalism. I feel there is a bias even within our American church where we're going to go and we're going to serve in some capacity, but we're the new Israel, and it's so problematic.
I mean, it's a disaster.
It really is. And I don't want to say this is for all churches, but I feel like if we understand our brokenness and our need for Christ, our nation's need for Christ, if we understand that, then I think then there's more of a willingness sometimes to go. Even our own nation, we know that a lot of times people are like, I'm going to get land, I'm going to get my guns, I'm going to get my silver, I'm going to, right?
Yeah,
there's this sectarian approach.
That's right. Absolutely.
This weird sectarian approach right now that's happening in the evangelical movement, and part of it's aligned with certain political views. But how is that missional at all?
It is, and you're right. It's not. It's not.
Right. No,
but it's a good point, and I think a lot of it comes back to this idea that we're one of the most syncretistic churches in the world, because we've and which is interesting, because that's something we always talk about in missions, and we think about undoing the syncretism in other places. All the while completely ignorant of our own syncretism. Yeah, so I don't think we're going to solve all of this today on our first episode, but this is a great start.
Absolutely. I love it. Welcome back to Sorry Not Sorry. I'm here, of course, with Dr. Ireland, and I'm just so excited to be able to discuss for a few minutes his sermon last week in chapel, which was an incredible call to our community here at UVF about our place within the Missio Dei. But one of the things, Dr. Ireland, that you mentioned was the way in which certain things in missions will wreck our worldview. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's a huge idea. And so I was talking about the book of Jonah, and and how one of the themes in Jonah is not only, I think, God sort of trying to stir in Jonah a compassion and concern for the Ninevites, for the sake of the Ninevites, but also because God wanted to do something in Jonah's life himself.
Absolutely.
And I, as somebody who's been involved in missions for about 12 years, I think that's very much true. I think missions often is a process in which our own worldview gets wrecked. And that's a really good thing to happen. It's good to have the apple cart turned over, so to speak, because we need things that will sort of jolt us out of our Western comfort, that'll make us force us to see the world in a different way, and cause us to become compassionate for people maybe that we weren't compassionate about before. And I don't think that's something we can affect ourselves. We can't make that. We can't change our hearts on our own. We can't make ourselves love people that we've never met.
Absolutely. One of the things that was interesting, a lot of times when I hear a sermon on missions, it's really just talking about we're going to go and serve them. Which it was an essential part of it. But the idea that missions is also almost part of sanctification, I mean, is that?
Yeah, I said this in the sermon. A friend of ours in Africa who's worked in Africa in some really, really difficult places for something like 30 years, and she's been in war zones as a single lady missionary and just some really rough places. And after all this time, one day she said to me and my wife, she said, the longer I'm in Africa, the more I feel like God brought me here to work out my own salvation with fear and trembling. Wow. And I thought, that's absolutely true. Yeah. Like, missions helps undo our own brokenness. And so we need to participate in missions just as much to get us out of some of the things we were just talking about, like our nationalism, our American syncretistic forms of Christianity that we're completely blind to until we encounter this other world that is just radically different from our own.
I love it. So let me just ask this one question, because this is sometimes a tension. You see someone like yourself who's been a missionary for 12 years in Africa, and no one's questioning the authenticity of that. Mm-hmm. But then you see a group of 18-year-olds who say, we want to go for 10 days, right, over spring break. And sometimes I think people question motivation. Is it going to be about that community? Is it just about them? I mean, how can you speak into that, especially now as the chair of our MLT department?
That's a great question. And I think missions teams can be either really healthy and productive, or they can be a disaster. And it all starts with those teams having a very healthy understanding of what they're going to accomplish.
That's good.
If a team thinks that in 10 days in Africa they're going to save country XYZ or whatever, that's just pure fantasy. That's rooted in a self-centeredness that desperately needs to be undone.
Right, exactly.
So I think if they understand that they have just as much to receive, then just that perspective alone has the ability to make the trip much more fruitful, because it suddenly takes them out of this position in which they see themselves as in an over-under position, but it sets them not only at a level position, but maybe even as somebody coming to the African church to receive and right. to learn what can we gain from the way that Africans do church.
And even like, as you said in your sermon, you're talking about Jonah and the Ninevites. I mean, Jonah was somewhat arrogant. And then I think it took the process of being broken for him to finally be able to proclaim truth.
That's right.
And that's such a huge process. But sometimes in being able to go and being broken, can you ultimately then proclaim the truth that you need to proclaim?
Yeah. And so when you see missions from both sides like this, I mean, it's almost like God knew what he was doing.
I know, right? What are the
just,
chances?
Yeah, I mean, so
No, but it's true. I love it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not, yes, it is about going to the nations and proclaiming, but also there is a personal element to your walk and your sanctification. It's
Yeah.
both and I think that's what's so exciting, and that's, I think, why we're so passionate about
yeah.
it.
And so when I, like in missions, I've had people say to me, you know, things like, you don't really think we should send missionaries to places like Iran and Iraq, do you? And I'm shocked by that, because that statement is rooted in the idea that Muslim people deserve God's wrath more than they deserve God's love, something that they would never apply to themselves.
Right.
You know,
Absolutely.
and that's fundamentally broken. Like
It
that's a deep-seated brokenness that takes a jolt before you can come to realize that, before you can come to see it for what it is.
So let's say that whether you're 18 or whether you're 50 and you're considering going on a mission trip, what's one thing that you would say that someone should maybe pray about or consider so that they can hopefully have that openness on whether it's 2 weeks or 10 years?
I would say go on a missions trip as a student, as a learner, no matter how old you are, no matter
great.
what your perspective is, no matter what you think you have to offer, go as a learner and go with an openness to being taught by the people of the culture that you encounter, because we by no means have a corner on the truth and on knowledge, and people of other cultures have incredible things to teach us about community, about togetherness, about koinonia, that we really do a terrible job at in the West.
Oh, that's great. Well,
So
thank you, Dr.
yeah,
Appreciate
thank you.
It's
Appreciate
been fun.
it. Hey, thanks for listening, everybody. Tell somebody about Sorry Not Sorry, and we'll see you next time.